I'm continuing my discussion of the Galileo case, and when we left off yesterday, Galileo made an agreement with Cardinal Bellarmine to the effect that he would not publicly teach the heliocentric theory. He would continue his experiments, but he wouldn't be a public advocate so as not to, you can say, confuse the faithful, confuse the ordinary guy. And for years, Galileo kept this pledge, but then something happened that caused him to change his mind and make what turned out to be a terrible misjudgment. There was a new pope. Cardinal Maffeo Barberini was named Pope Urban VIII. And by the way, Barberini was considered kind of a scientific progressive. In fact, this is a guy who had fought to prevent Copernicus's work from being placed on the index of prohibited books. He was also a fan of Galileo's. He had written a poem in which Galileo's name was mentioned in a very positive light. So Galileo was like, okay, all bets are off. I don't have to be bound by my old strictures and my old conditions. And I'm going to now write. And Galileo began to write his a book for which he's now well known, called A Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, which was published in 1632. Now, problem for Galileo was he structured this book as a dialogue between a guy named Simplicio and Galileo himself. And apparently Simplicio represents the Pope. And the Pope is sort of like the dumb guy. And the Pope in this dialogue makes dumb arguments which Galileo easily swats down. And so the net effect of reading this book is it looks like the Pope is a fool and Galileo is the really smart guy. Now, this was, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. In other words, the Pope himself was a sophisticated man and had his own kind of view of science, which at the first glance may sound a little bit strange, but is in fact a view held by many scientists today. So let me describe this view. The view is that science is not a mechanism for discovering laws of nature. Rather, science is a mechanism for describing the world as it appears to us. In other words, the Pope is drawing a very subtle distinction between nature as it is, nature out there, and the world as it is perceived by human beings. So in other words, science is useful because it helps us to make useful measurements and predictions, but these predictions are not about the world per se, as they are about our experience in the world. Now, there are physicists today who believe that this is true, that when we perceive the world through our experiences. And so science is a record of those experiences, not necessarily of the world in itself. In other words, not of the world as it is if there were no human beings, let's say, in it. In any event, this was the Pope's view, and you won't be surprised to learn that the Pope was very unhappy that Galileo was portraying him as a buffoon, and he, Galileo, as being the guy who got everything right. Now, Galileo did in fact get everything right. In fact, in the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, one of Galileo's kind of knockdown arguments in favor of the heliocentric view is the tides. Galileo basically argues that the Earth must be moving around the sun because that's how the water in the oceans gets sloshed around, and that's how we get the tides. Now, if you know anything about science, you'll realize that this argument is in fact completely wrong. The tides have nothing to do with the Earth going around the sun. The tides are the result of the gravitational force of the sun and the moon acting together on the Earth. That's what produces the tide. So Galileo is offering, in this case, a completely bogus argument. Galileo also attacks Kepler for taking the view that planets move in elliptical orbits. Galileo insists that planets move in purely circular orbits. Of course, we know now that Kepler was right and Galileo is wrong. So the point I want to make is, and this is kind of how science develops, just because Galileo is a great scientist, and he is, doesn't mean he's right about everything. In fact, some of his arguments for the heliocentric system are now known to be flatly wrong. And at the time of Galileo, this, as I say, was an unsettled issue. So the fact that it isn't even so much that this was a debate between religion and science, it's a debate between competing scientific theories. There's the geocentric view, which was advanced really before the medieval period, in fact, before Christianity. And then there is the heliocentric view. The heliocentric view is gathering momentum, but the point I want to make is it's not until about 50 years after Galileo that the argument for the heliocentric view is completely settled and confirmed, and the heliocentric view is now acknowledged and known to be right, and the geocentric view is known to be wrong. In Galileo's time, there was still an ongoing and legitimate argument about this. And so the trouble that Galileo gets into with the church, and I'll talk more about this as I pick it up on Monday, isn't just because of the scientific theory, but is also because Galileo wanders into other thickets. He starts talking about the correct way to interpret the Bible. And let's agree that as a physicist or as an astronomer, this is not something that Galileo knows a whole lot about.